Hello, welcome. We're going to wait about 30 seconds and let everyone trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here. Okay, welcome to the first webinar in the Online Ethics Center's Fall 2021 series. Our webinar is called Bringing Ethics into the Conversation, and we're thrilled that you've joined us today. So my name is Wylie. I'm an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at the University of Virginia, which is where I teach engineering ethics and data ethics. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Online Ethics Center before we get started. It's hosted at the University of Virginia, and it is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters an active community made up of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who can come together to share knowledge and discussion on ethics. So please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our fall webinar series is data ethics, and it is sponsored by the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. And I'm absolutely delighted to kick off our series with our speaker today, Dr. Lauren Klein. So what we're going to do is Dr. Klein will speak first, and then she's going to have a discussion with Dr. Michele Claibourn, who is the Director of Equitable Analysis at the University of Virginia. And then we're going to have some time for questions from you. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please type your question in there, and then I'll read it to Dr. Klein. All right, so Dr. Klein, one of my favorite scholars. Her work has been very influential in my research and my teaching. If you don't know her, she is an associate professor in the departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Before moving to Emory, she taught in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. Klein works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature with a research focus on issues of gender and race. And in 2020, while most of us were just trying to get by, she published 2 books. One of them is An Archive of Taste, Race, and Eating in the Early United States from the University of Minnesota Press. And the other, which she co-wrote with Catherine Dignazio, is Data Feminism from MIT, which is fully open access, and I strongly encourage you to check it out. So Lauren, we are delighted to have you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, for that kind introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. I should say before I share my screen, it's so nice to be invited to UVA, both because, as Caitlin mentioned, my background is in digital humanities, and UVA and the work of the Scholars Lab and many initiatives before that has just been so formative in my own scholarly development. And now to watch what's happening around data science with its emphasis, and it seems to me quite intentional, on questions of equity and social justice. Just really exciting to see, and I'm really just thrilled to be in conversation with all of you. I am going to try to share my screen here. Let's see how this works. Okay, let's just move the Zoom menu out of the way. So how does that look? Okay, super. So today, in these first couple of minutes, which I hope won't run too long, I'm going to explore the question that you see on the slide right here about what data feminism actually means. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that this talk is based off of a book that I co-authored with Catherine Dignazio. You can see her on this slide. And the other thing to know is that if you're curious about the book, you can access it online via that link at the bottom, datafeminism.io. So what I'm going to do today is briefly summarize the book's theoretical framework before moving on to a set of examples drawn from the book of work that illustrates data feminism in action. So just to jump right in, the motivating premise of our book is that in the world today, data is a tremendous form of power. Data-driven systems have been used somewhat infamously to decide which people who have been accused of crimes to send home on bail while they await trial, and then which people to keep in jail for that exact same crime for that exact same time. Of course, that decision sets off a cascading chain of consequences that almost invariably impacts the rest of their lives. And I'm talking here, you might be familiar with this already, about ProPublica's audit of so-called pretrial flight risk assessment algorithms, in particular one designed by the company Compass. You might also think of work by Virginia Eubanks that has shown how data-driven systems have been used to identify parents suspected of child abuse, very often unfairly, wrongly, and with understandably devastating consequences. Or even in the academic arena, you could think of the recent fiasco in the UK around the algorithm used to predict A-level exam scores, since the exams themselves were canceled due to the pandemic. I mean, I really could go on. I could spend all of my time just enumerating situations like this, but the real point is that data, is incredibly powerful, but that power is currently wielded unequally. And more specifically, it's wielded by a small group of well-resourced institutions, primarily located in the global north, with leadership primarily consisting of mostly elite white men. And so this is where feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, enters in. But before I would dig deeper into the argument that we make in the book about why data science needs feminism, I just want to do some very basic level setting. So, what do I mean by feminism? And just by the way, this is Beyonce who you're looking at. Actually, in her song Flawless, which is what she's singing right here in this image, she samples what turns out to be a really helpful basic dictionary definition of the term. So here in the song, this sample, feminist, the person who believes in equal rights for men and women, to which we add non-binary people. So what you can take away from this is that feminism at its core, sort of its very basic meaning, is a belief in equality. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality has not yet been realized in the world. And so feminism also, and I want to emphasize necessarily, involves organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality. And then feminism has this third definition, which academics may well be familiar with, which has to do with the set of theories and ideas. And these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But over the past 40 years of scholarship and sort of the continuing political reality, this has brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, these include class, sexuality, ability, and even more. So this sort of brings me back around to this idea of intersectional feminism and how, in our view, when we say this in the book, feminism right now, in the year 2021, must be understood as intersectional. And again, this may be review for many of you, but if not, intersectionality, this is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which she uses to explain how social inequality cannot be described in terms of only one dimension of difference, like gender. So when we're talking about inequality or oppression, we have to be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. So again, this is racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. So the really important thing to understand about intersectionality, and this is actually something that's often overlooked in many casual invocations of the term, is that intersectionality isn't just describing markers of individual identity. So it doesn't just mean, I, Lauren Klein, am white, am a cisgender woman, I live in the global north, in the US South. It's not just describing these aspects of my identity. What intersectionality as a theoretical concept is explaining are the structural forces of power and their intersection that make the effects of those aspects of my identity matter, that produce the effects that I experience going around my everyday life. And it's been the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about forces of power. And I really, thinking about it in visual metaphor, I almost like to think of it as like a rack focus, taking feminism, which had prior to that been concerned with these questions of identity, and really pulling back and saying, okay, what are these underlying forces of power that are producing the effects that I feel? So the basic argument that we make in the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help this unequal balance of power that sort of it currently represents in the world, can help this unequal balance of power be challenged, be rebalanced, and be ultimately changed. Or if you just wanted to put it in more simple language, data science really needs feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to have a chance of overturning these power imbalances that we see all over the place. So what we do in the book is to use the teachings of intersectional feminism along with other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought in order to arrive at these 7 principles that you see listed here for doing more ethical and equitable data science. And our goal with this really was to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a very clear set of principles for people currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, or for people who want to refuse to work with data for ideological reasons. And we can talk a little bit more about that later if you feel like. And in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each of these principles where we talk a little bit about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle, and then illustrate how it can be applied to data work through a lot of examples. I don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because I think the conversation that we're about to have will be more informative. But I will just run through a couple of examples that do come from the book, not one from every chapter, but a couple that bring together multiple principles, I think, in a single project. So one of the projects that we talk about pretty early on in the book is this one. It's by the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha. It's called The Library of Missing Data Sets. And as you can maybe tell by this image, it's actually an artwork. It's displayed in 2 ways. And the first is as a GitHub repository. You can Google it, look at it right now. What it does is list the missing data sets that you can see screenshotted here. So you can read titles like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. And so you can encounter this project online. You can also encounter it as a physical installation, and that's the file cabinet that you see pictured on the left. And the idea with this version is that you walk into the gallery, see this file cabinet with folders, you read the names of the data sets on the file tabs. You go to open one that you think seems interesting or important or pressing, but when you do, you discover that the folder is empty because the data sets are missing. And the point that Onuoha is trying to make in this piece is that these data sets, they're missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this imbalance of power is what determines what data are collected and what are not, or what research is conducted and what research is not. So, like who has this power? Governments, moneyed institutions. Who generally tends not to have this power? Minoritized groups. And so this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access, and in turn the questions that they prompt, have already been affected or overdetermined by the imbalance of power in the world more generally. So what do you do about this? One thing to do when you identify a missing data set or a power imbalance at a data set source is to head straight towards the problem and collect this missing data yourself. And I should say, just as a caveat, this is not always the right approach. And again, we can talk more about why sometimes collecting data, especially on smaller and more vulnerable populations, is not always the best answer. But oftentimes, one response to the problem is indeed to collect this data. And a good example of this is the work undertaken by San Francisco's Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. They're also known as the AEMP. And since 2013, this group has worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in the Bay Area in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis there. So what you're looking at here is a map that indicates with each little red dot a place where a person or a family or a group was evicted. And then the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP has also interviewed one of the people who was evicted from that place. So you see on the right a screenshot of their video interviews. This is one with a Midtown resident named Phyllis Bowie. And in the book, we contrast that AEMP map that you were just looking at with the work of the Eviction Lab. This is a project, or a team rather, based at Princeton. And the Eviction Lab's goal is actually quite similar. It's to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say at the outset, before I sort of draw out this contrast, the Eviction Lab's goal is quite worthy. It's a really valuable project, but it's wildly different in terms of process. And actually, as it turns out, in terms of accuracy, although not in the ways that you might think. So you might just take a look at this image, keeping that other image in the back of your mind and say, oh, okay, I think they're using bigger data, right? They're presenting us a more comprehensive picture of the eviction crisis in the United States. I'm looking at a map of the whole country rather than just a small region. You might even say, I think it's a little bit more of a rigorous project. Certainly they're using Mapbox or something to make their visualizations as opposed to the Google Maps interface. You know, all that said, the AEMP has shown that national real estate databases like the ones that the Eviction Lab uses significantly undercount evictions. And again, if you pause for a minute, you could think about some of the reasons why this might be true. First of all, any data set produced by the real estate industry is not incentivized to count any more evictions than they have to. Second of all, and I think especially for students listening, you can think of all of the different ways that you can be evicted from your home that don't involve actually going to City Hall and filing a formal eviction notice of the sort that is recorded in the database, right? The landlord can just not fix your leaky sink or the hole in your ceiling or lurk in your lobby or raise your rent. Like, these are all ways to get you out of your home. These are de facto evictions that don't enter these formal, broad data sets. But because the AEMP works with local community organizations, so the places where people go and they say, like, help me, this is happening to me, what do I do? And the AEMP has developed a process for recording these experiences as data. What they've gathered is an admittedly messier, but actually a much more accurate picture of what is truly happening with respect to eviction in the Bay Area, their object or their area of focus. And so in the book, we actually also talk about this project as an example of another feminist principle, which has to do with pluralism and what can be gained by embracing pluralism. And by this, we mean inviting many different people to the data science table, many different people representing different groups, different levels of experience, different degrees of proximity to particular issues, inviting all sorts of folks to the data science table, and crucially listening to them, honoring their experience as well as their expertise. So I actually just have one final set of examples before we get into the Q&A, and I'm going to switch focus a little bit here. The previous examples have focused mostly on the issue of power and people. So people who have power and then people who don't have power. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power, and more specifically, binary structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. So one of the things that feminist theory has helped to show is how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And once you see the hierarchy, you actually start to understand why that hard line is there in the first place. And this is to ensure that the group on the bottom stays there and doesn't sort of creep up in to challenge the power of the group on the top. And so you can think, the distinction between the idea of man and woman, this is the obvious reference point. It was actually the starting point for feminist theory, because it's a clear example both of a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? There are more than two genders, and among them, no single gender is better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and use the same model to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So you could think of the distinction between nature and culture. This is why feminists love cyborgs a lot. You could think of the distinction between teacher and student. This is why a lot of feminist pedagogy has to do with reorienting or sort of dismantling the hierarchy that authorizes the teacher to be the source of knowledge and the students to be only these passive receivers of that knowledge, when the reality is that, as all of us who have ever taught anything know, you learn just as much from your students as they do from you. But actually there's a third binary that I'm going to focus on next, which also follows along these lines, which has to do with the artificial distinction, and it's a hierarchical distinction between reason and emotion. So in the general Anglo-Western context in which most of us are operating, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data science and in data visualization in particular. So best practices for data visualization usually involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, presenting just the facts. These stylistic choices are thought to be more rational and more objective, even as research has shown, research both from computer science and from sociology, has shown that we tend to interpret these choices just as emotionally as any others. We tend to believe that these types of charts are actually more truthful than they actually are. But I want to think about the opposite. So what happens when you embrace emotion as a communicative tool and deliberately leverage it? And this is what the example that you've been looking at helps us think through. So the large Black images that you see in the previous slide and the larger one here, they're actually screenshots of an animated visualization. And again, you can Google this and watch this while I'm talking. I will not be insulted. It actually is probably a better presentation strategy. Anyway, it's by the design firm Periscopic, and the project is called US Gun Deaths. And what you will see if you go to their website is the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a single calendar year. It's an animated visualization, as I mentioned, and each of the people killed by a gun in that year is traced out on the screen one by one as a single arc. That's what you can see in the smaller screenshot on the left. So they start out really slow, so you can read the identifying information associated with each person, and then they get faster and faster until you can no longer read them. Also, you can no longer identify where one arc ends and one arc begins. It's actually, they employ rhetorically a bad visualization thing called occlusion, meaning sort of plotting too many data points on the particular grid or canvas that you're working with. But for them, it is a point, it's the point. So these arcs, as I mentioned, they're traced out one by one, they get faster and faster. They create this sort of semicircular web. And then it also goes on for so long, to the point where you can no longer even tell really that new lines are being added to the plot. And it's actually, I find it really overwhelming to watch, like almost unbearable. You think it should be done, but it keeps on going. You think that certainly already too many people have been killed by guns in this year, and yet there are yet more. And that's kind of the point, it's overwhelming to watch. It goes on for too long because there are too many people being killed by guns in the United States, right? Now, I just want to back up and say methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study. So the data about the people derived from a national crime data set released by the federal government. Their projected lifespans are determined using a World Health Organization model that takes all sorts of factors into account. But this project was viewed with intense suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel things. Now, a feminist approach here would say that's actually not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling visualization precisely because it blends reason with emotion. It rejects that false binary. And what happens when you allow yourself to rebalance emotion and reason is you're opened up to a much wider and richer data communication toolbox that in turn allows you or me to focus on what really matters in a design process. So honoring context, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge some of the imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. So this brings me just to the final point I want to make before our discussion, which I think in many ways is probably obvious from the examples that I presented, but is worth making explicit. And it's that data feminism insists on an expanded definition of data science. So our data science is not defined by the size of the data set or by the technical credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these concerns are continually and have historically been used to exclude women and people of color from technical fields, as well as, I should mention, to exclude work that makes a contribution that is socio-technical rather than purely technical or methodological. But if we expand our definition of data science, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, and by activists. In short, some of this work does look like traditional data science. We've screenshotted some of this here, but it can also look like interactive sculptures, like data journalism, like murals that you paint on the wall. And we have, hundreds of examples like this in the book, which we selected to illustrate our points and to inspire our readers to action. Because I wanted to end on sort of one of these main takeaways from the book, especially for this audience, which is that, while we recognize that data is at the root of so many problems today, it can also be part of the solution. And I think this approach to data feminism really has a lot to contribute to that task. So that's where I'll end my formal remarks for today. We can talk more about any of this or any other questions you might have. I just wanted to leave you with many, many, many ways to contact and learn more about Catherine's work and my work, websites, Twitter, GitHub, Instagram, email, all of these things. And yeah, I will welcome your thoughts and impressions and ideas. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Your work is so fascinating in every format that you presented. And I hope the audience is noticing your infographic behind Michele and me as our backgrounds. All right, so now we're going to pass on to Michele to spark some discussion with Lauren. Dr. Michele Claibourn is the Director for Equitable Analysis, which is maybe the greatest job title ever, for the Equity Center at UVA. She's also a political scientist at UVA's Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. She leads the Equity Center's community engaged data science work, which includes racial equity studies for the city of Charlottesville, our local county, and the Thomas Jefferson Area Coalition for the Homeless. Michele, thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I was so excited when Caitlin asked if I would be willing to have this discussion with Lauren, with Dr. Klein. I was like, yes, I would love to have time with Lauren to talk about her work. And for those watching, if you haven't yet read the book, I just cannot recommend it highly enough to you. I've used it in several classes, and my students and I always walk away with following new threads or with new kind of revelations. And so, and it's also just strikingly beautiful. So some of the slides that you saw Dr. Klein present just now, I think give you a sense of that, but the book is loaded with visuals and examples that are going to absolutely make you think and make your work better. So let me just give that little plug first, but I really want to, I have so many things I'd love to dig into, but I want to start with this, some work you do in the book to really articulate and build out and operationalize what it will mean to do data for co-liberation. And so I think this work speaks, and it should be of interest to, an emerging movement that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years around efforts to do data for good or for social good or data in the public interest, or it goes by a lot of names. And I'll be honest, for many years, I've avoided using any of those phrases because I don't really understand what they mean. And they sort of feel like whatever the speaker wants them to mean. So I tended towards language like data for justice, but encountering your work, you speak directly to this in chapter 5, where you talk about doing data for collaboration, and I found that framework so powerful and so helpful in my own thinking. And as somebody who, especially in my work with the Equity Center, tries to be consistently, deeply community engaged, I just found that language, it just provided a scaffolding that made lots more make sense to me in a way that I maybe hadn't been able to fully articulate to myself before. So that was super powerful. I will also say, as somebody who tries to do this, operationalizing that, like actually practicing that, is a challenge, right? It generates a variety of obstacles. And I'm hoping we could talk a little bit more about how those of us who want our data-oriented work to be pushing for collaboration, right? Really more than just not doing harm and more, but something positive, how we might start that, what that might look like. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for all of the kind words, and thank you for teaching with data feminism. Every time we hear that it's being taught in the classroom, it makes us so happy, because one of our primary readers that we had in mind when we were writing was always students, and so to hear that it's resonating is just, it feels good. In terms of collaboration, so I'll just sort of back up and sort of define some terms before I get into your question about sort of operationalizing this. And I'll say that, so this idea of collaboration, it's another sort of principle of working towards justice. And it has to do in many ways with the point that I began by talking about, this idea of a rebalancing. And collaboration very generally entails this belief that we are not individually free unless all of us are free, that our liberation individually and collectively is bound up with each other's. And usually what this entails from an academic perspective, or I'll back up and say, in academic research, and even I would say the structure of many well-intentioned, even nonprofits and social organizations, they're not necessarily, they're not set up for this. Academic research tends to be fairly extractive, where we might identify a problem someplace else and seek in a very well-intentioned way to sort of help and to solve that problem. But the research involves coming from outside, identifying a solution from outside, and then ultimately taking the research back in order to publish it, get more grant funding, get promoted, what have you. And I would say also, it's not, again, the problem is not just on individual researchers, but academic reward structures and funding structures and all these things are set up to encourage exactly this type of work. And so in the book, we try to take on this kind of extractive, primarily academic, but also industry-led sort of data science for social good type work, and think about what it would mean if rebalancing, if sort of our shared liberation was kept as the goal. And more practically, what this involves is a couple of things. With respect to resources, resource sharing, so making sure that communities are compensated for the work that they put in. It's not just, we don't just view the input of communities as, oh, well, this will help them, so they should do it for free, but actually involving communities as real research partners, compensating them for that work. And I think also, if technologies or systems are put into place, ensuring that the burden for maintenance of those systems does not ultimately fall on the communities themselves, who presumably were under-resourced in the beginning. In addition to funding, I mean, there's this very basic, approach of just listening to the communities first before you develop your idea of what the project should even, or what the intervention should even be in the first place. Again, oftentimes in academic research, we'll do a focus group at the end, or you'll do user testing. You'll come up with this whole thing, and then at the end, you show it to the potential users, whether, range of users, anyone, really, this is just how research is set up. And you say, what do you think? Where it could very well have been that you were trying to address a problem or an issue that wasn't even the most important problem or issue in the first place. Whereas if you bring the impacted community members into the process at the very beginning, often, and again, listen to what they have to say and really let them direct the goals of the research, you very well may end up with a different type of project than the one that you had in mind. This is connected to, again, sort of larger structural difficulties with respect to actually doing this work, which is, it's very often difficult to build trust in communities if you don't already have a relationship with community members and they know that they can count on you. And so a lot of this work, absolutely takes more time than the limited timeframes that we as academics have for pursuing and developing research. And I say it's not just at the faculty or staff level, but also graduate students need to have publications in order to get jobs. Postdocs need to have publications in order to move on in their careers. There is the need for, to adhere to certain types of academic publishing and research timelines. But I do think just in terms of specific things that you can do, in many ways, it does fall on the project director, whether it's the director of a lab, the director of some sort of internal center, faculty member themselves, to take on the work of community building well before there's a particular research question in mind. And I personally, what I like to do is invite speakers to my classes just to talk about the work that they're doing, which is an easy way just to sort of get on each other's radar and hear a little bit about the work that's taking place, to see if on the one hand, there are members from those communities that can be brought into existing research projects, either as sort of a skill share or knowledge share, or the flip side, sending students to those particular organizations who are looking for internships or volunteer work, with the caveat that sometimes managing students is more of a burden on community organizations than it may be worth. But again, just looking for these small opportunities to build relationships early on without a specific goal in mind, other than just this belief that the work that this community group is doing is good and something that you are interested in and want to keep on knowing about, so that when the time comes to pursue a major research collaboration, you will already have those relationships in place. I would also say, especially in grant proposal writing, taking a stand on compensation for community groups and just writing it into the grant proposal and saying, look, these are co-PIs here, or these are significant researchers involving domain expertise that are at the level of other research staff, and just making the case for that. And I have seen that work, when it's just, when it is stated with authority and conviction. And so that's another thing that you can do. I'll just stop there because I know that you have a lot of other great questions, but those are just some initial thoughts.
That was amazing. Thank you. And I just want to hit on a couple of them. And one of them in the Equity Center, much of that work is exactly what you're saying, is kind of building relationship and trust prior to a project. And it does take time. And I just want to hit that home, because I do talk to a lot of people who deeply want to do this, but maybe haven't fully absorbed the fact that it's going to take some time, right? It's going to be a little putting in the sweat and the work before you kind of come to a fruition of something you're ready to pursue. And that is, I think your example about the San Francisco anti-eviction mapping versus the eviction lab is another, kind of illustrates another thing I think we try to do, which is we take a pretty hyper-local focus, in part because that's who we can have a relationship with, and that's who we can compensate for being part of like advisory groups and incorporating. I think there's often a little prestige factor for being national versus local, and that's one of those other little maybe binaries that are a little bit troubling in terms of how we do our work. But I want to segue into something that I think really comes up in what you said. And one of the key principles is about making labor visible. That you talk about the enormous amount of invisible labor that underpins a lot of the data science and data science knowledge infrastructure on which the whole kind of domain depends, right? There's this enormous volume of labor necessary to create data, to document it, organize it, manage it, maintain it. And that's very, very frequently performed in really unequitable and unrecognized ways, right? From the kind of most extreme examples of the exploitation of often MTurkers, right? The gig workers on Mechanical Turk, who are often in the global south, who perform much of the data labeling and cleaning that underpins a lot of data for like pennies. Also used as cheap research subjects in a lot of academic work, right? But also even within the university system, I think we see a lot of unrecognized inequitable distributions from professionals from, I spent some time in the library and love my library colleagues. And so I can see how much work they do to kind of maintain this infrastructure without any with very little acknowledgement, I guess is what I want to say. Also in the hierarchies of the university system in terms of, it's often students or grad students or postdocs doing a lot of this work in ways that aren't fully accorded the full respect maybe or acknowledgement that is necessary. And so this need to make labor visible, I just think is so important. And I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about how those of us in here, I'm thinking especially in a university setting, right? Students, staff, faculty, others, who are, I'm just going to say, already deeply embedded and complicit with a pretty hierarchical knowledge infrastructure to start with. How could we do more to help name and elevate, value, and compensate this invisible labor on which we depend?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, and it shows up all the time in academic research. I mean, I think the humanities in particular, I have a funny appointment where I'm split between the humanities and the social sciences, and I would say it's improving, but I would say the humanities are lagging the most, just in terms of their openness to acknowledging co-authorship, sort of normalizing that and recognizing that almost all projects are co-authored. It's just that we, especially in the humanities, are not used to giving credit for all of those co-authors. I really try to do that in my own work anytime that, students have been involved, whether undergraduate or graduate, whether collaborators have been involved, and try to emphasize that, honestly, I think that it is a reflection of the quality of the work. It does not diminish from the contributions, especially of a faculty member who's involved students on a project, to include them as co-authors, because it shows the ability of the faculty member to do what they're supposed to do, which is teach students what research looks like, involve them in research projects, and ideally help them start to formulate research ideas of their own. And I don't think anything really bad happens when you do that. I feel like there's often a lot of fear, oh no, they'll view this as a co-authored thing and it won't be that important. No one is going to look at a piece that is directed by a faculty member, or for that matter, first authored by a student with a faculty member attached as an advisor, and say, in my view, this can't be interpreted as anything less than an affirmation of that faculty member's ability to, again, do what were hired to do, which is ensure that research practices are taught and carried over into the future. I think, again, the issue with the distinctions between faculty and staff, if staff members contribute to the intellectual shape of the project, they absolutely should be included as authors on papers. When it is in the process, more administrative, obtaining rights for the use of a data set or something like that, they should absolutely be credited in footnotes or acknowledgements. One of the places where I think digital humanities actually has a lot of good models to offer to scholarship writ large is in the production of fairly detailed credits pages associated with digital projects, that, again, in places where it's not everyone is contributing either the same amount of work, the same type of work, the same degree of work, having a more detailed credits page where you can say who exactly did what, in many ways offers a lot more flexibility to acknowledge someone who may have been on the phone with your legal department to negotiate a rights agreement, who is not necessarily, participating at the level of authorship in a project, but nonetheless was essential to that project even existing in the first place, right? So there are a lot of different models out there. And I think that I would say is, it's so interesting to me, and I see this all the time, the fear of including people in a project versus the reality of what happens once they are included, like those are not commensurate with each other. And it is not a hard case to argue for the value for everyone of naming and crediting more people for their work.
Thank you. I love the detailed contributions page idea. It's so easy now to create something as a supplement to work now, that I feel like I have no excuse to never ever not do that again.
I will say, just to add in, one of the things making me think about, though, there's a really good set of documents one is called the Collaborators Bill of Rights and the other is the Student Collaborators Bill of Rights. And one of the pragmatic things that they say is that you, as the project director, must absolutely keep track of people as they come and go on a project instead of doing it at the end, because if you wait a couple years, it actually becomes quite hard to remember everyone who was involved. So absolutely just keeping track and having a system of who was involved for even a single semester or a single task is super important to not leaving anyone out. Sorry about that. That just was a little pragmatic note.
I love that direct resources to look up is perfect. And that's one more thing, because I know we have some audience Q&A, but I want to just tell you that one of the things I really love about this work is how I feel how invitational it is. You know, from the onset, when you had, if you don't, people might not know this, there was a collaborative revision effort of this work where the book was up and people could come in and make suggestions or give feedback or criticize, that was then incorporated into the final book from the continued availability of an open access version. And honestly, the reflexivity of the way you did and publicized a citational audit of your work is a step towards a citational justice to sort of whose voices were being included in the work. I think all of that just models this invitation in ways that's so admirable. And honestly, just the real accessibility of the work, right? It's clearly a lot of attention paid to making it accessible to a wide range of perspectives. And I think that all is so powerful. And most invitationally in your last slide is the call to expand our understanding of what counts as data science, to have a more inclusive claiming of that label. And it's a label that has a lot of currency. It's associated with power. And so I want to ask if you could just tell us, by way of invitation to the folks here today, about who, like essentially just an encouragement to who should be claiming that title, if it's useful to them, right? If it feels okay to them, not to have it thrust upon them, but as an invitation, feel empowered to do that. What other sorts of folks would you say should be feeling invited into that domain?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is a theme, as you mentioned, throughout the book and also in the presentation, that there are so many different types of data, and there are so many different modes of doing data science, which I take to mean any systematic analysis of information that was itself sort of systematically collected, right? And I think people tend to hear the term data science and think it doesn't include them, when the reality is that there's so many people, especially to your point earlier about local work, doing work on the local level to sort of what they might see as collecting information, communicating information, things like this. But all of these involve techniques of data analysis, techniques of data collection, techniques of data communication. And very often, these are the same people, because of their position either in a community or their occupation, or their affiliation with any particular group, who might, again, have the best knowledge and the best awareness of a particular problem in need of being addressed. And so, I would just echo what I think I've already said. So this certainly involves activists and community organizers, it involves artists, it involves educators, it involves humanists, it involves all those who are trying to bring together interdisciplinary approaches to data science and data work more generally. We need all of these things. And I think that that is connected also to the ideas that we framed this open peer review and this collab sort of request for community feedback with, which is that, one of the very basic feminist tenets of feminist theory, and this comes from folks like Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, all these feminist theorists who have tried to critique and ultimately strengthen ideas of objectivity, is that all of our knowledge is partial, right? No single person knows everything. No single group knows everything. But if we want to achieve the most complete knowledge that we can, we fundamentally need to involve additional perspectives and bring additional perspectives into our research process, and figure out how we can use those perspectives to complement each other and fit them together, so that ultimately what we produce collectively is this more complete sense of whatever question or object or object of study that we're seeking to explore. And I think that, the same is true for data work. We can learn so much from people who are taking different approaches to these same types of questions.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin, because I know that there's some wonderful questions in the queue.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm going to follow up on what you were just talking about, Lauren, with a couple of questions from the chat about, you were talking about how to make space in data science for people who might not identify as data scientists. So if we flip that around and say, how do we make space in data feminism for people who identify as scientists and engineers? Like, how would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this comes back to another really basic feminist teaching. And I guess it's related to what I was saying before about rejecting the idea that a binary choice needs to be made, that if you are doing quantitative work, you can't be doing qualitative work, that if you are doing methods work, that you can't also admit, other type applications work or potential uses or harms into your scholarship, right? Very, very rarely in life, I think this is a good life lesson, are we confronted with a truly either or choice, right? It is almost universally the case that there is space for both and. And so that's really my approach. The goal is not to say you shouldn't be doing a particular kind of work because you should be doing another kind of work. But if you are not doing that particular kind of work, look for other people who are and think about how you can bring those types of work together. I especially feel like this with respect to a lot of, to me, what seems to be these recent interventions into, like the big AI trend du jour, which is these large language models, right? Where there's been this trend towards, okay, how can they we know they're biased. If we use them, let's benchmark them. But, or how do we sort of quantify the output or the results or the bias or whatever it is that these models produce? And that is viewed as like the one path forward. But alongside that path absolutely should be an incorporation of thinking through the larger social impacts of these language models, thinking through the potential for harm, these sort of dual use situations. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. And I think it would be helpful for most people to recognize when they feel that they are coming from a defensive position, which might incline them towards resisting additional scholarship or different ways of approaching the same issue, and instead say, look, we're all focused on the same goal here. How can we create models, not technical models, but just conceptual and academic models, ways in which these different forms of scholarship can be put in more conversation with each other.
Thank you. That's a lovely explanation. And I find that my students in data science and engineering are often a little put off by the word feminism. But then when I show them, your 7 principles behind me, they're like, oh, yeah, those are obviously good. And they understand how that applies to their work. And they just are thrown off by the word feminism, which is interesting. So the way you've explained it today, I find incredibly helpful and much clearer than the way I've been explaining it. So I just want to finish with a question about what next. So Lucy Bassett would like to know what policy or topic areas you think are well suited for being the next frontier for data feminism.
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, like everything, but I will say, the one where I sort of feel like there is a need and there is growing awareness, and I think there are signs that feminist approaches are being considered, if not explicitly named in the output, has to do with government policy and regulation with respect to both data systems, algorithms, social media platforms, and the like. The way in which the EU and I would say in general, the EU and the UK now, I guess, remains to be seen about that, but the EU really has led in terms of proactive policy with respect to, I would just say, technologies in general, whereas the US tends to be a little bit more reactive in its policy, sort of responding to some sort of incursion of privacy or political control or whatever. But there's been recently this sort of aspirational document release, which has to do with ethical regulations of AI systems in the EU. And it's not, it's an aspirational document in the same way that I think the GDPR began as, although the GDPR over time was sort of filled in and fleshed out with policy in a way that ultimately I think has impacted the global web community in positive ways. I do know that in the same way, these guidelines for ethical use of AI that have been now announced but are still sort of vague, there has been a lot of feminist thinking about, or if there have the policymakers have been reading a lot of feminist theory, and I know this, I've spoken to some of them, and thinking just about how questions of equity and need to be thought through in terms of multiple dimensions, about how questions of equity are fundamentally tied to questions of ethics. And so I'll be interested to see what that what shape that takes. I have seen, interestingly, certain at the federal level in the United States, there are some, I believe it's a couple of senators who are interested in something like the FDA, but for data. I think that, for instance, Kristen Gillibrand has sort of this vision for one of these federal agencies. That seems a long way away to me, but one would hope that eventually that would be a place for feminist intervention and impact. The other place I'll say that we're seeing a lot of ideas about equity and justice and sort of social groups more generally is, interestingly, like in the HCI and sort of more human-oriented computing space. There have been a number of conferences, and actually some of the NLP space as well. There have been a number of conferences that have in recent years begun to ask for unintended consequences or potential impact statement to accompany any submitted paper, to include an ethical review in the peer review process. And all of these, I think, initially there was some grumbling on behalf of some people that this would be hard to do. But when these things are normalized, they just get people thinking again of these, again, not necessarily intentional harms, but the potential impact that could come about once these systems make their way from purely being academic think pieces or systems to really being implemented in the world. So that's another place where actually I think there is a lot of hope for me.
Excellent. I'm so glad to hear that, and I agree. I share your hope. All right, that's all we have time for, and it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here, Lauren. And we'd like to, there's a bunch more great questions in the chat that we don't have time for, but we'd like to invite everyone to continue this conversation on the OEC discussion board. To participate, you can follow the link that Courtney's going to drop in the chat for us. So you have to sign up as a member, which is free. And you also get access to our newsletter and discussion forums. So yeah, we're also thinking about establishing a community of practice on data ethics through the Online Ethics Center, and we'd love some input on how we should do that. So if you'd like to be involved, please get in contact. And we'd love to see you at our next talk, which is on October 14th, which will be a discussion of data ethics pedagogy from Dr. Anna Lauren Hoffman. So thank you very much, Michele and Lauren. I'm also grateful to our director, Rosalind Byrne, our coordinator, Courtney Lazore, and UVA School of Data Science. Thank you.